Welcome back, everyone. Today's explainer is jumping right into a totally fascinating timeline based entirely on our source data, charting the historical trajectory of the BJP. We're going to neutrally map out everything from its very inception, its explosive rise to an absolute majority, its absolute peak in public approval, all the way to those dramatic electoral shifts we just saw in 2024. So let's see what the data actually reveals.
Okay, let's get right into it. We're going to cover the early shifts in political power, the BJP's rise to an absolute majority, their peak of popularity, the 2024 turning point, and finally 3 very specific reasons for their recent decline. We are tracking this from the 1950s all the way to today.
Starting off with Part 1, Shifts in Political Power. To really make sense of the present reality of Indian politics, our source material grounds us in the critical political landscape of the past. If you trace the historical data, you can see how heavily the pendulum used to swing in just one direction. Back in the 1950s and 70s, Congress held this completely one-sided dominance. Our source notes that being the only major national party gave Congress immense, practically unchecked power. And that eventually culminated in the 1975 emergency, which was a period widely scrutinized for its authoritarian shifts. Well, it was out of this specific environment that leaders like Atal Bihari Vajpayee and L.K. Advani recognized the absolute need for a strong alternative, officially forming the BJP in 1980. But, as we know, building a national presence takes a lot of time. By the 1984 elections, this new party managed to secure just 2 seats.
Fast forward just over a decade, though, and the political landscape shifted dramatically. By 1996, the BJP had surged to 161 seats, running practically neck and neck with Congress at 140. Then in 2004, the margins were razor-thin all over again, 138 for the BJP, 145 for Congress. We're looking at a clear transition here into a coalition era, a time where neither party could independently secure the 272 seats required for a full majority.
The source material actually describes this balanced era as India's peak tilt toward high democracy. Why? Well, because when no single party holds that magic number of 272 seats, they are literally forced to build consensus. To pass any bill, the ruling party had to sit down and negotiate with the opposition and regional allies. And more importantly, altering the Constitution requires a 2/3 majority. So in an era where a party couldn't even secure a basic majority on its own, the Constitution remained virtually untouched by unilateral party agendas.
Which brings us to Part 2, the rise to absolute majority. That era of compromise we just talked about was about to experience a massive disruption.
The data marks a staggering turning point in 2014. The BJP didn't just win. They secured 282 seats completely independently, blowing right past the 272 majority threshold while Congress plummeted to just 44 seats. The coalition era was officially over. With this kind of mandate, the source argues that Narendra Modi became the undeniable singular face of both the party and the nation. I mean, if a candidate was simply aligned with him, that alone was often enough to secure victory.
Now, our source draws a super interesting parallel here. On one side, we have the 1970s Congress wielding unilateral power that eventually sparked fears of dictatorship during the emergency, and on the other side, we have the post-2014 BJP. By ending the coalition era, the BJP found itself in that exact same position of absolute power. The source highlights that this concentration of power naturally brings back similar public anxieties about a single entity having the theoretical capacity to alter the Constitution without needing any widespread political consensus.
And by 2019, that power only grew. The BJP surged to 303 individual seats. When you factor in their alliances, they were pushing past 350. This wasn't just a majority anymore, it was an ironclad mandate. They finally had the raw numbers to pass major, unchallenged legislation. And as our source notes, they absolutely didn't hesitate to use it.
Which leads us seamlessly right into Part 3, the peak of popularity. Armed with this unprecedented political power, the BJP entered an era where its key figures enjoyed virtually universal public approval.
A real defining moment of this peak happened on August 5, 2019, when the government abrogated Article 370. This was a massive constitutional change, utilizing their huge majority to fully integrate Kashmir into India, bringing it under the national flag and anthem. According to the source, this move was widely praised across the whole country, even by staunch critics of the party, as a necessary step toward economic development and job creation in the region. It also totally skyrocketed Home Minister Amit Shah into the spotlight, making him this wildly popular figure right alongside Prime Minister Modi.
But hey, it wasn't just major constitutional moves. Think about this metric for a second. 37 kilometers. That was the staggering amount of daily highway construction happening across India by 2020. Infrastructure was visibly, tangibly improving, and the public attributed this directly to Nitin Gadkari. He even earned the beloved nickname the Highwayman, basically representing everyday, boots-on-the-ground development for the average citizen.
And out on the global stage, we saw incredible moments like this quote from Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar back in 2022. When pressed by a reporter about India's neutral stance on the Ukraine-Russia war, his super sharp response, highlighting Western hypocrisy, went absolutely viral. The source points out that this created an absolute peak for the BJP. It wasn't just about Modi anymore, right? Multiple cabinet leaders were being universally praised, generating viral edits and immense public pride. The party was essentially seen as this unstoppable, unified force.
But as we know, in politics, momentum is rarely permanent. Let's move to part 4, the 2024 turning point, which is exactly where this narrative begins to shift.
The source actually attributes the genesis of this shift to 2023. That's when Rahul Gandhi actively worked to shed that dismissive, Papu image that had been pinned on him for years by political opponents. By rebuilding his public persona, he began to present a viable, renewed alternative for voters who were just starting to look for options outside of the BJP's total dominance. So heading into the 2024 elections, the BJP launched a highly ambitious slogan, Ab ki baar 400 par, meaning this time cross 400 seats. The intent there was clearly to project overwhelming strength. However, the source argues this heavily backfired. Instead of rallying support, the sheer scale of the ambition sparked widespread public fear. Voters began to really worry that if one party secured 400 seats, they would have unchecked power to alter B.R. Ambedkar's constitution, and not for national integration like Article 370, but potentially for unilateral, party-centric gains.
And you can clearly see the result of that public apprehension reflected in this number, 240. In a stunning halt to their previous momentum, the BJP secured only 240 seats in the 2024 elections. They fell short of that 272 majority mark, forcing them right back into a reliance on coalition partners. The source actually identifies this exact moment as the definitive drop in the so-called Modi wave.
So the really crucial point here is understanding exactly why this drop happened. Let's unpack part 5, 3 reasons for decline, as outlined by our source analysis.
The source distills this whole electoral and public image downfall into 3 core arguments: the push for self-favorable bills, a policy of strategic silence, and a fundamental loss of authenticity among top leaders. Let's break these down one by one. Reason number 1 centers entirely on legislative ambition. When the BJP removed Article 370, voters genuinely felt it was for the good of the nation. But more recently, the push for massive initiatives like delimitation and one nation, one election struck a totally different chord. According to the source, the public began to perceive these huge structural changes not as national development, but as tools engineered specifically to consolidate the BJP's long-term power. That creeping fear of constitutional manipulation directly cost them votes.
Reason number 2 is strategic silence. Our source points out that during major public protests, or when the opposition raised really critical issues, the BJP often chose to just remain completely silent. Perhaps they were hoping the controversies would simply fade from public memory. But this strategy really alienated voters, because instead of looking strong, the party appeared disconnected and unresponsive, which effectively eroded that loving and accessible image they had spent years cultivating. And finally, reason number 3, a pretty devastating loss of authenticity among those previously beloved leaders. The source highlights massive infrastructural failures, like collapsing bridges, which did a lot of damage to the party's whole development narrative. More specifically, it points to Nitin Gadkari. His aggressive push for 20% ethanol blending in fuel, which, by the way, didn't actually lower prices as expected, drew heavy scrutiny when the public linked the policy to his son's ethanol manufacturing company, CIN Agrotech. The source claims that these perceived conflicts of interest completely shattered the trusted image of the party's top brass.
Which brings us to the ultimate question to wrap up today's explainer. Based on the data and the wild shifts we've just explored, will the BJP be able to adapt their strategy to survive in this renewed era of coalition reality? Or is this downward trend in public trust going to permanently redefine the landscape of India's next general elections? It is an absolutely fascinating political puzzle, and I hope this explainer has given you the clear, structured insight you need to watch it all unfold. Thank you so much for joining me. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.